Good evening. Welcome to the final lecture in the spring series. I always forget the title, Dreams, Beliefs, and Fantasies. That's it. Tonight I think, I'm hoping, I know of Ray's beliefs and some of his dreams. I'm hoping he shows us some of his fantasies tonight. I've speculated on what they might be. Oh, this is written exactly the way I'm supposed to say it. It says, Michael, before Ray begins his lecture tonight, thank the lecture committee for their volunteer effort in putting this all together. Lecture committee is, I know all the students by first names always, just their last names are always Vivian. I'm probably gonna blow this one. Pienkanagura. Is that right? Yeah. Let's applaud me for that one. Pienkanagura. She's one of the only students. We broke policy. We have a policy that we don't accept anybody with 5 syllables in their last name. She's got 5. Amy Burson, Chris Perry, Dave Reese, and Dina Silverman. And the faculty advisor, Michele Sae, who's and the staff advisor to just about everything, Rosemary Rabin. I think it was an ambitious lecture series, and the format, I thought, was quite an inventive one. And like everything else around here, the students are usually willing to experiment with just about anything that seems to pop into their head. And I think this lecture series was certainly a format that'll be tried again. So I thank them for being not only working hard, but also being inventive with the lecture series itself. And then a special, and another also thanks to Margie Reeve, who's the head of exhibition and publications here at the school, for assisting with the program. And then the brochure, I had 2 students who've been doing some graphics here at the school, I think quite exceptional graphics, Sheridan and Nicholas, who are both in the graduate program. So thanks to all of you for pulling this off. Okay. I'm going to try to keep the introduction as factual as possible. It seems that every time I introduce Ray, the difficulty I have is in introducing him is that I was raised in this place, so to speak, having been in the first group, or one of the founding members, as we say, of SCI-Arc. I was a student in the first graduating class. So I think of him in some ways as a sort of surrogate father. But I'm going to try to not make him blush. I've known him since 1970, when I was intent on transferring schools from San Luis Obispo to Pomona. The reason I wanted to transfer there was because I had heard of this new program where there was a number of young faculty teaching, and I was told that it was quite an adventurous place to be. It was a relatively young program, and there was things that were being tried there that weren't being tried in other places. That was the beginning. Made the right choice. It was fortunate for me that I showed up at a time when there were certain things that were going on at the school that ultimately led to all of us leaving. And I don't think that anybody could have planned it as well as things have turned out. As many of you know, we left Cal Poly Pomona under the wings of Ray, who had said, let's start our own school. I never imagined that, in retrospect, that it would have turned out this way, nor that it would have seemed to be as easy as it was. In fact, it wasn't easy. It was hard work. And I guess it seemed easy because of the way Ray ran this place for a number of years. Ray graduated from the University of California. Some of these dates, I always think everything just happened 5 years ago, but in fact it didn't. 1951, he started practicing within a couple of years of graduating, and has been in private practice ever since. He's practiced as both an architect and a planner. He became an educator in 1969 when he was asked to start the program at Cal Poly Pomona. 3 years he was there. I was there for 2. I think the excitement that was generated there, and the kind of camaraderie, as well as the passion that we were all instilled with, spilled over into this place. And that's how this place was founded in 1972. He was the director of the Institute until 1987, upon which he decided to step down, and I was elected to the position. He's still on the board and a faculty member. In I believe it was 1990, about a year ago, which I think was belated, he received the Topaz Award for Excellence in Education, which is the top award that's given to an educator. About the work, just briefly, because he'll talk about it in detail this evening. I think the one thing that was, in many ways, it seems to be an obvious thing to do when you're setting up a school and the way you want to structure it. But I think in all of the schools that I've been to, it seems to be quite a radical idea. That is to establish a faculty that not only teaches, but practices. I think with regard to many of the things that happened around the school since the beginning, and many of the things that are continuing to happen, the format of having people do 2 things at once is a common format around here. Teacher, practitioner, architect, builder, etc. I think Ray's work, in my mind, is whenever I think of him or think of his work, I think of him as an architect-builder. Historically, architects were seen as builders. When it moved into being a white-collar profession, architects became very much removed from the process of making buildings. I think Ray's interest has always been in making buildings and setting a very high aesthetic standard. When you look at his work, I think that the aesthetic is very directly associated with material and method of assemblage. I think, for me, that's been one of the most influential aspects at a personal level. At another level, I think what the work is been able to express in a very clear way is the relationship of buildings to sites. I think it happens in a very specific way in the residential work, particularly his own house. But I think it also has a sort of theoretical extension into his work as a planner. Back to the contribution, I think, that he's made to architecture, which I think in the scheme of things will be seen as being exceptionally extraordinary. The founding of a place like SCI-Arc and the ability to not only conceive of it, but to actually have both the character, the insight, and the vision to allow it to apparently construct itself. In fact, it didn't construct itself. It was built by what I would call, and what I truly believe to be, a magician. And with that, I give you Ray Kappe.
Someday I'm going to travel around the world with Michael and have him introduce me to various places and various people. I'm always somewhat flattered by his introductions. In fact, I sometimes wonder if I should talk after he introduces me, because I sort of destroy the whole illusion that has been put in front of you. This series has been interesting to me too. It's kind of nice to be back. I think this is the first time I've presented my work, I think in about 10 years at SCI-Arc. It's also nice to be bookended with one of my favorite architects, John Lautner, around the series. And it gives me the feeling that if this has taken place, I guess postmodernism, at least the historicist aspect of it, must be over if the two of us are back in place. Most of what some people categorize as postmodern, I don't categorize as postmodern. I can just talk about it as being part of the modern movement. It's just a continuation. The other thing that I liked about this series, especially, was that I've heard a lot of words about planning, urban design, people talking about ecology again, a little bit about environment. These are words that have been missing, I think, in many of the schools now for quite a while. And I think we're going into a period where we no longer can really hide those feelings any longer, and I think the need to be socially, politically responsible is really very much a part of an architectural education. It isn't that we solve problems that way, but we as individuals have to be involved in those processes in our being as actors in society. The other thing that's really interesting to me about the series is that I think, if I remember right, the very first series that we ever put on at SCI-Arc back in '73, when Shelley and I put it together, I think it was pretty much the same way. I think John Lautner kicked it off, and I think I completed it. So here we are almost 18 years later, and I think we've come full circle. So it gives me a feeling like we're off into another time, another place. Okay, I'm going to be doing a lot of talking tonight, showing maybe more work than I should, but my career goes over not 45 years, but that would mean I would have started when I was 18 years old, but I did start when I was 26, and it probably covers close to 37 years. And it does have three facets to it. It has the architectural facet. I did do a lot of building myself. We did a fair amount of planning, and I was involved in education. And I always feel somewhat undressed if I don't, do the whole thing. And in this, of course, you will see my beliefs, and I will express to you some of my dreams. And I don't really have architectural fantasies. And the other fantasies I'm not going to talk about tonight. So with that, I will set my place and time. First of all, like John, and as I was depicted as a cowboy, I'm pretty much just a shoot-'em-up guy. We didn't learn to talk very well in the late 40s and early 50s. The architecture was something you did and built and didn't talk about much. And the talking started a little bit more in the mid-60s, late 60s, into the 70s, and got pretty heavy in the 80s. So we really, you saw the way John presented his. It was hard to keep up with the slides and the dialogue at the same time. I'm almost that bad, but maybe not quite as much, and yet I think it was wonderful. So mine will be somewhat like that, and I will start the lecture by putting setting the time and the place. Los Angeles has always been special. We had an architecture of modern architecture to be proud of and to follow, and we didn't really have to look east, and we didn't have to look to Europe. We had enough examples happening here, and enough of a dynamic and enough of a support system from arts and architecture to make us feel that we could really just take off in our own hometown and start working. That's something that was very unique. And I remember one night when Michael and I were introducing the school to some new graduate students, he made the statement, boy, I'm glad I started to work when I did because it's so much fun now. And I thought, God, you know, it was a hell of a lot more fun when I started, I thought. And both times were kind of great times, I think. They were different, but I think they were pretty great. And so let me just jump into the slides and we'll go from there. Okay, I start at the turn of the century, and a lot of this series has been about opposites. And really we had two prime examples of architecture, one by Greene and Greenes and the other by Gill, that are really opposites in our area. Of course, we do have many climate zones, and so it would stand to reason that not all the architecture of Los Angeles would necessarily look alike anyhow. And of course, the Greene and Greenes were an example of the bungalow style combined with craftsman, combined with shingles, combined with the Japanese influences, and Gill's product was really one of looking at Spanish colonial revival, cleaning it up, and having almost a Loos-like quality about it, but predating Loos by quite a few years. That then, by the late teens and early 20s, we had Schindler coming into Los Angeles, doing some supervision on Wright's work. And Wright's work was Barnes doll, as you know, and most of you are aware of these photos anyway, and the block work of Wright, and actually Schindler's own little house, which was very influential for many of us as we look back and began our own careers, because it was an exploration in tilt-up concrete, redwood. It really expressed what Los Angeles climate was about, and it had a quality of really extension into the landscape, and also it was an experiment, a social experiment in lifestyle. Quite different really from his own Lovell house, which was really a kind of a combination of his writing experience reinterpreted, but it had a great deal of European quality about it too, and in a sense I have always felt it probably had went back to Europe and influenced Corb at a later date. Neutra's Lovell house had the same kind of influence, and really his dialogue was very much with, I've always felt, and I know Shelley's always felt this, with the Dutch, like Rietveld and Dijker. Much of the work over there was so similar in those days, and seemed like the communication was going back and forth across the oceans. But neither of these were as influential to architects like myself as maybe Neutra's later work as he hit the 40s, where this work now begins to be much lighter, starts to extend out into the landscape, and really starts to blow the skin off of the strip window European-looking work that they brought over, and as was Schindler's more sculptural and plaster. So this was not the work that really influenced my generation of architecture, the plaster work, but it was much more this lighter work that you see of Neutra's. Also, the work of Soriano in the steel explorations was influential, but it was more influential to architects like Elwood and Koenig than it was to some of us who really picked up the wood idiom. In the house you see to the left is Greg Ain. These were all students really of Neutra at one time, Ain and Soriano, and then Harwell Harris, who I'll bring up next. And Ain really was sort of a simple architecture, but he had he was very socially responsible in the way that he worked, and very simple in what he was doing, and it was very understated work. one of the greatest influences for some of us who became known more as the wood post and beam architects of post-World War was really Harwell Harris's reinterpretation of the Greene and Greene work. And I don't know how many of you are even aware of Harwell Harris. I doubt if many are, but here you see a simplification of what was a 40-year span of an idea. And for many of us, this was more what Southern California was about. This is the kind of thinking that we began when we started our work. And my early work was a combination of all of these things. Combination primarily of the Harwell Harris interpretation and Neutra's extensions into the space around. And these houses were for young engineers and young veterans after World War II. And our belief at this point in time, my belief, was very simple. We were interested in such a thing as lifestyle, how one lives. That's pretty simple. It's not very esoteric, but I think it's pretty important. And the houses were inexpensive. They offered, I think, a much greater airiness. They were much more about California than what were the conventional houses that were going on. These are houses in the valley. There wasn't air conditioning. The trellis and the shading and the combination of water made these places livable and very livable. And their extensions into the landscape were important. And these were modern houses, but they're not flat-roofed houses necessarily. They dealt with just a simple notion of house. And what bothered me so strongly when postmodernism began and the writing about modernist architecture, which I hate that term, was that everybody immediately interpreted as that there was a bunch of white boxes, or else it was the Misesian universal solution, or else it was Corbu's mistaken planning principles and Gropius's inaccuracies about what could be done socially through architecture. That was a very oversimplification of really what modern architecture was truly about, at least for me, and I think for many of the California architects, and those of you who are here who worked in that same period of time, and there are a few, I think understand that. The houses were open planned, but had potential for closure. The room, like the study that you see behind, could be closed or open. This was principles that Greg Ain used quite often in order to expand the small house. These are small houses that then could feel much larger. Areas, there were usually outside areas, terraces, wherever we could work them in, and decks, and a very open kind of a scheme. And this was true of a whole body of work now that I'll be showing you over the first, say, 15 years of my career. The landscape was as important to us as the building itself. The extensions were important. Most of us did our own landscape design. We certainly did all the hardscape for sure. The trees were important because they were integrated with the architecture as elements, and our architecture was not made to stand alone in fields, but it was made to be incorporated with nature and with the trees around us. There were extensions like these that were just screened in post and beam trellised areas that weren't even included in the square foot count when we would figure our costs. And at this point in time, houses were building for $10 a square foot like this, and conventional houses were going for $9. But the amount of volume that we gave and the extra outside areas, which were also part of that budget, made the houses very much, well worthwhile. The other aspect of this period of time was that the other really belief and goal and dream that I had was that these were not meant to be just one-off houses for single individuals, but they were meant to be part of what we had hoped would be a total neighborhood plan. And Greenbelt Planning was key at that time, the idea that you would take an area of maybe a mile square with the school as a center point, so people didn't have to walk more than half a mile, that the kids wouldn't have to cross the streets but could travel over the greens and parks in that neighborhood, and shopping facilities were easy at hand at the corners, that multiple dwellings would be mixed with single-family dwellings. And all of this was where I was hoping to be going with these explorations and design for just single individuals. The use of materials were usually those chosen by the owner. If they preferred brick to block, they had brick instead of block. If they preferred stone instead of brick, they were given stone. These were not the key issues to me. Furniture was designed in many cases and built in. This is furniture of my design, but we didn't make a fetish about it. It was just something that we did if we had the opportunity to do it, and it was something that was important if it could be, could be done. I think many of the things that people do today are wonderful in terms of the way they work with materials, and they do have the care of what they're doing, but it comes out of a process that's quite different than the process that I went through, because I was involved at a time when we did whole buildings, and we did whole buildings pretty quickly. I was usually working 5 or 6 of these houses a year, and building most of them myself as well, not by hand, but doing the construction management aspect of it. And we didn't have time to really talk and philosophize and theorize or get too involved with every single little detail because we were too busy and had too much work to do that. But we did care about all these parts, but in a slightly different fashion than people later, who I think added an element to architecture which is quite good when they became, by working internally in buildings, became very much involved with the pieces. And the pieces became very prime because they weren't necessarily working with the whole. And this added a very good element to architecture. And I think we see that around us, and I think these are some of the nice things that came out of the explorations of the 70s and 80s, and I think it was a nice thing that came out of much of the work I see around here that's so well crafted and so well thought about in the manner that it's done. And we were doing it as well, but in a slightly different way. The details were the way beams would be interplayed with walls, the way the glass was inset, the way the spaces might be developed. Just slight little moves and by through the process, but care about the way the building was crafted. These houses, some of you may have grown up in houses similar. The planning process was usually around the kitchen, which was the key element. The family room was usually to one side, as we see here, out to its own patio and eating area that was external. The other side would be to the dining room and the more formal side. Quite often the master bedroom suite was separated from the children's area that was usually related to the family area. And this housing was housing 4 families. John Lautner's work, which was going on at the same time, but which was much more unique in the period, was not always, I don't think, as much about family as it was about special individuals. Many of us, I'd say a couple dozen architects, were working in a sort of a common way. This was, as you see the work that I'm presenting here, it was much more of a common manner of working, and we weren't really, I don't think, trying to, let's say, rise above each other. We were really much more, I don't know how to put it. It wasn't about the individual stardom mentality. It was really much more about a group working towards a direction to change, not to change the world, but to present another lifestyle to people, another option to people that we thought was much better. The little outside terraces off the bedroom or off the bathroom, at this time we were doing special baths and sunken tubs and what have you. But dealing with these kinds of private spaces, some of them were a little larger and for people who had a little bit more money, but most of them were 1,500 to 2,000 square feet. Some got up to 3,000. This house has some of the same characteristics as the one you saw before. Again, the family room out to the pool area, the corridor down to the kids' playroom and the bedrooms around that, the use of the combination of flat ceilings, the long gable that I used quite a bit because it gave you a varying volumetric experience, and this interplay of these kinds of elements. Again, houses in which you would enter and get an experience of a terrace to one side and to another, then go inside the house and view out again. House to the right is one that was one of the few that I was able to do in steel. It wasn't that I didn't like steel, I did. Steel was more costly than wood. It was less acceptable to more people than wood. But in certain instances, like the one on the right, the owners wanted a full viewing surface, so the whole glass surface to the view could not have shear panels, and they didn't want X braces. So what we did was flagpole steel and held up a roof at this side, all glass to one side, concrete block at the other. And in this case, all I provided for the owners was a shelter. They did their own construction of their kitchens and bathrooms and all the things that were near and dear to them. And I think that's kind of a nice process in many cases, particularly when baths and kitchens become as such an involved aspect of design as they do today by people. Another long gables, short gables. I had the opportunity to do enough work to just explore and look and observe at full scale. So I could solve the problems, the site problems, the programmatic problems, all the issues that architects work with. At the same time, begin to understand space, begin to understand construction better, and work. So they're similar, but they have variety and they have individual qualities about them. And for me, as I said earlier, the trees and the landscape were very, very key. And I'll get into it a little bit more when I talk about deconstruction and construction, if you will. I mean, we've heard a lot of, as I said, opposites in this time. Stanley Tigerman had his new two opposites that he was dealing with, which were integration, I think, and disintegration, and construct, deconstruct, order, disorder. These are all elements that have always been part of architecture, and they're important. And many of you, I know, are working with these ideas and trying to understand them better, and sometimes I think probably work a little too hard deconstructing before you know how to construct. And no, it's really true. I think you have to learn to construct before you can understand really how to take it apart better. And then I wonder sometimes whether we have to take them apart as much as we do, because when you look at what a tree does to a wall, it actually disintegrates it itself by the shadows and the shadow play, and actually it interrupts the construct and in a way deconstructs, and you don't really have to work too hard at it. If you allow this kind of interplay through the building, I think it gives you many things in a very simple way that some of us work very hard to do the other way. And I think when you really get into it later, and you take a deconstruct and then try to put glass in it, it becomes a very, very difficult thing to fit those spaces. It's a lot easier, obviously, when it has a certain order to it, to do that. And it's also a lot easier when it's just a pavilion. Open pavilion is what I'm saying. So these are... I'll just move on through this series. And there's just a model showing the constant use of the simple post and beam, the woody goodies, as Glenn used to call them, and because they were made up of wood and trellises, and as I said many times before, for a period people used to kid me about being the master of the 2x2. Because the trellis was important, but it was important because it was a shading device, and it was a way of also breaking down the light in special ways. Because I think sometimes you want to let the light in full, sometimes you want to break it down, and the shadows that you get out of the trellising is similar to what you sometimes get out of trees. As the years went on, the houses sometimes got bigger by the early 60s and into the mid 60s. People were making a little bit more money than they were in the early 50s, and houses for individual clients got larger. As I said, I never had the opportunity to really do tract housing, which I really wanted to do in a way, not the way tracts were done, but wanting to do it better. But developers didn't come to me, but they did come to some architects like Ed Fickett and Palmer and Kreisel and Quincy Jones, who did a great number of tract houses in much the manner of the work that I previously showed you. And actually my own experience while at Berkeley was with Anshin and Allen doing Eichler homes, which were what Quincy Jones was doing down here, and also some in Northern California. And then when I came down here and I worked with Carl Maston, I was working with him with doing garden apartments and additional housing, similar to what we were doing up in San Francisco. But by this time, actually, as I said, the houses were getting a little larger. I was now beginning to incorporate laminated beams. Much of the wood, the 4x12s were starting to twist more. The lumber wasn't as good as it was in the earlier 50s. The lam beams could hold their own. We had better potential to span further with it. And so some of the things I was doing were starting to change slightly. Of course, this is a house that's on piling, and the piling was expressed through the columns that continue up through the building and support it. Once again, the trees are the deconstruct. And the use of obscure glass, we used a glass called Factorlite, and I used to like it a lot because, again, the tree shadows were very nice against this particular glass, and they had a very wonderful quality about them. And then I dropped back quite a few years and start up again with garden apartments. I did quite a few garden apartments through this period, and the process there was slightly different but somewhat similar to what I was doing in houses. I was trying to take very small units. These were in the 500-600 square foot range, and very simply by adding one wall that would, on the right slide that you see there, that would close off the kitchen and the bath to some degree, and a wardrobe that could move around in the space. One would have the opportunity to make a no-bedroom apartment or a smaller bedroom or a smaller living room, whichever one wanted. And so this gave, I thought, opportunity for young couples to have a certain amount of flexibility in a very easy and simple way. At the same time, a little, not really at the same time, but going after the garden apartments, going a few years later, for the first time I was back to really doing the kind of work I was talking that I wasn't as influenced by earlier, which was the plaster work. But I had a few developers come in who gave me the opportunity, or wanted me to see if I would accept the opportunity to build apartment housing that was better than what was being done conventionally. They would give me, they were building for $9.25. They said they would give me another 25 cents, and if I could build for $9.50, they'd let me do what I would want to do. And so I was able to get a little bit more out of it. I was able to get 2-story units where, that were a little more open than the normal boxes. I was able to develop terraces to the front side as well as the back. I was able to explore the idea of a balcony walk where you always have to walk past the apartments to get in, which was kind of a no-no in my planning book from the way I thought about things. But by raising the private terrace a couple of feet, actually 3 feet, using a 6-foot wall, I was able to get the separation necessary for privacy for these units, yet they were still able to look out and over. On the back side, we had terraces that would then collect and go back to the pool behind. And I tried to sculpture the plaster a little bit. Some other units and the condos and so on and so forth that were done to that period. And then there was, getting near the latter part of the 60s, had the opportunity to do some low-income housing. And the only thing I didn't like about this project was that the Community Redevelopment Agency set the architectural style, if you will. Sea Ranch had just been completed a year or so before, and even though this was not the way I like to work, we had to do one-way sheds because somebody in the agency thought that was the way architecture should look. The opportunity to explore low-income housing, no matter what, was important to me, and these were very cheap, down in the $8–9 a square foot range in the late 60s. And the nice part about this, however, was that I think most of our effort was put into the amenities, the play equipment, the pool and daycare center, the basketball hoops that were going to be next to the laundry room so that they could be supervised by the parents, the ability to ride bikes around the place and have a fair amount of green and decent space. And so this was the first opportunity to do, like I said, we did about 250 units here. And the disappointment, and I'll go through that a bit, because we used to always see I don't know if you did that much, but we'd always see the Pruitt-Igoe being blown up by, and Charles Jenks making the great statement, this was the end of the modern period because modern architecture had failed. The reality was it didn't really make too much difference whether you were doing high-rise or whether you were doing low-rise like this. That's fairly humane looking, I think. The people who we were building for really didn't want to be in projects, if you will. They didn't want the stigma of the project, high or low. What they really wanted was individual housing, or they wanted housing that did not say, you are here because you are low income or moderate income. And the sad part about that is that when Nixon came to the presidency in, I guess, early 70s, he picked up, I think, on this particular point of view and stopped the housing policy completely. And so there was some infill housing that took place little by little through the next years, but through most of the Republican administrations, we just didn't get back to a housing policy. And so we've gone for almost 20 years without one. Architects like myself who had a shot at trying it once didn't get a chance to really go back in and evaluate and see maybe where we could take it from here. But it's a very difficult problem, and one that I think we've all opted out of because there wasn't this policy. And I would like more of you to get back into thinking about these kinds of ideas and these kinds of concerns. Otherwise, we're not going to have cities, I don't think, in which to live too much longer. And here I show kind of another condo, about 24 units, and this was a transition period in my work. I really got to a point where I was starting to do work that was a little more conventional in its mentality. It was, as you see here, it was about developing units. And I was really more interested in repetitive housing. And so at this point in time, I had the opportunity to build on this adjacent site, although I kind of hated to remove those rocks, and I probably wouldn't have. But what I began to do was care about a system that I felt could be built on site or in the factory, and would be able to be controlled a little bit better, could be multiplied, would have potential for use in low-income housing possibly. And so I began to work with this idea of the core, and taking the core, which could be, craned into place, beamed between, and then living in bedroom units slipped in, independent of the other part of the structure, and pieces like the balcony unit then tacked on. And it was supposed to work for this apartment next door. That project didn't go ahead. Later we had an opportunity, as you see on this slide up here, to do some student housing, and once again I tried to incorporate that idea that would be a series of these core units that could be placed together. The dark indicates the living, and the light, the bedroom units that could be tied in. And these were some potentials that could be developed to work out to be apartment units like you see there. I mean, student units, housing units. And then when that project didn't go ahead, we actually designed it in this modular fashion. We designed it also as a panel system, and we also designed it conventionally. We did 3 sets of drawings for it in order to evaluate the bidding process, even though we worked with the contractor the whole way, and he felt we were in line with our modular system. We wanted to kind of cover our bets, but the owner and developer decided to back out for other reasons. He was involved with political aspects, and he decided he didn't want to get involved with student housing. But I then went on to use my private individual houses as an exploration for this idea. And what you see here is a series of plan types that were used for exploration of this system. And you see 4 different variations here. One very axial and simple. Another, my own house, which was a series of 6 units and living space here, the 2 bedroom spaces here. Another one that tended to stagger more. The service units varied somewhat because the early ones were 8 by 12 by varying heights, and in some cases I would use 4 by 12 by varying heights. I was using a plywood module and trying to work it that way. Anyway, there was a series of houses that explored this idea, and I'll just go through that process with you and show you what came out of those. Now, in all cases, all the vertical and all the seismic loads are carried by these core units. That left the rest of the house free and to do with it as we would. The other thing, and most of these sites at this point in time were sites where the soil conditions weren't as good, and so by concentrating the loads, I was able to also concentrating the footing points. I didn't have to use grade beams between these tower units, which you do when you have column systems. And this allowed it to be a little more flexible. The other aspect of it is they were usually raised off the ground. The siting was such that they didn't dig in, I guess similar to some of the discussion that John Lautner went through, in which he raised them in different fashion, but this was the manner in which I worked. This gave you the ground under the house to use for play and for other purposes. It gave you then the house itself, its level, and in some cases we then used the roof too. So it was kind of a California version of the Corbeau principle of pilotis and raising buildings off the ground, but probably in a more relaxed California manner. I like shots with people in them. We don't do enough of that, I don't think. Cats and stuff that really makes the world work. Fortunately or unfortunately, I think today most of us shoot our buildings before anybody gets their furniture in, because it has a more pure state to it, and it's clean and clear, and it's about our architecture and less about how people live in it. I think that's a problem in one sense. It's elitist in another sense, and I think we understand it quite well, but I don't know that people understand that as a process of life. And again, by raising it off the ground, quite often the views that one captures are much greater than what you get if you're on the ground and down in the trees. You can sometimes be up and above the trees, which I tend to like to do quite often. And it gives you a greater expanse. This house actually covers almost 100% of its building site, after the setbacks, but when you're in the house, it feels like it's on, 100 acres, because it takes advantage of the canyons and all the parts around it. Same system being used for a larger house. At this point in time, this was a 7,000 square foot house, which is about the biggest that I had done at that stage. I was never much for big houses. I was much more about doing the little houses that I showed you earlier, but little by little things like this creep in, and you do them anyhow, and they are explorations for you, and there are things you can do in these kinds of jobs that you can't do in the small ones, because they sometimes have a little better budget and a little more room to play. This building is really entered underneath, and you come up and around and then come back and re-enter. And this is another good example, I think, of sort of my construct-deconstruct attitude, is that even though this building and all my buildings are really about construction, the shadows, the light, the trees, and so forth are really about taking it apart. And when you see the shadows that cross the beam, it starts to change the whole character of it. In a way, that becomes the fantasy for me. The reflections in the glass are the fantasy for me, because you have illusions that you never knew were going to happen. Reflections and mirroring that you didn't know would take place. And these are wonderful because they completely take the building apart. They move, in one sense you look out into the landscape, at the other sense you reflect aspects of another room that now floats out in space in a manner that is really wonderful. And I think if I were to fault what many of us do in education, is that that's a material, glass is a material that really is not dealt with very much in the classroom. It's a difficult one, I think, to really understand in the classroom. It really has to be understood on site in houses like you're seeing that were criticized by some people as too much glass, which I think they're a little out of their minds. But what happens for you is really quite wonderful. And maybe the reason I like it so much, I didn't go into my background, but I grew up as a kid always living in apartments. And always an apartment with a hole in the wall, like most apartments, the one window. And I always found myself at the window, and quite often sitting on the windowsill, looking out into the space. So I was always trying to get out of that inner space to the place beyond. And I always found this constriction of being held in very disturbing to me. And I grew up in Minneapolis, a place with some wonderful trees and lakes and parks in a Scandinavian sensibility, and quite a wonderful place. And I always wanted to be outside. I always wanted the air. I guess John and I are like that. I wanted the air blowing over me. I wanted to see the trees. I wanted the shadows. I wanted the sun. I wanted to know when the moon was shining, and I didn't always want to walk to the window, and I didn't want some guy to decide what my view should be, because most of the time they don't know what the hell they're looking at anyway. You have to move around. If you move, you can only do that if you're standing in one place. So as you move around, that view changes anyway, and I'm not sure that framing that one single view is so marvelous. I prefer to make that decision for myself, and I think people should be able to make that decision for themselves and have the wonder of what is happening in the day, how you experience that day, and what you feel and what you see. It's midnight and it's a full moon, it's a new moon. I mean, all those are wonderful experiences. The Japanese knew about that once upon a time. They forgot about it, I think. They were too busy westernizing. So, the reason I feel very comfortable with the deconstructivist movement is that I always felt that I was a deconstructivist. The work was about beams, planes, pieces put together, and whether these pieces are orthogonal or they're put at an angle or pushed around doesn't really make a lot of difference, because the parts work that way anyway to a certain degree. There are pieces that are going to change on you, even if you're orthogonal. And so, and even though that, you know, when John Lautner was talking about boxes, and he hated boxes, I guess I tried to prove in my life that the box ain't so bad, it's just the way you make the box. And I think you get as much motion and movement out of an orthogonal project if you're dealing with it in this. To change it in plan. Remember, you all know this, I'm sure, but a lot of times we make too many moves in plan and not enough moves in section. And the two things have to happen together in order to make a building. And when I'm also of the school that works inside out and doesn't care about the elevation or the facade because it takes care of itself. If you make the right decisions in plan, you make the right decisions in section, you make the right decisions in how you put the thing together, it'll look all right. And you don't have to worry about sitting there and determining whether it's the correct proportion or whatever it might be. And also in bathrooms in these areas, I mean, I don't care whether people want marble or tile or formica, or I don't think these things, they don't matter that much to me. I feel I can work with any of these things, and it's fine. And in fact, wood is not so near and dear to me, even though I'm considered a wood architect all the time, but that's primarily because the clients I get also prefer wood. And when they didn't prefer wood, you'll see later the jobs aren't in wood. They're in steel or plaster or metal skinned or whatever they might be. But quite often their tendency was to like wood. Why we like it, I don't know. Maybe it's because we can handle wood. Most people can understand the idea of how you nail a piece of siding on or a piece of plywood. It can be handled by themselves. When you're doing most people can't handle concrete. You have to have a little more experience to understand that, or they don't understand, they can't fabricate steel or understand the fabrication of steel or handle it by themselves. And so maybe there's that familiarity. It's the same with the way the brick used to be. Maybe they felt better about holding a piece of brick and that it was the right fit for the hand and that they could work with that versus maybe some other material. I don't really know. There's probably a whole psychology of material that probably people like Coy Howard and others know much better than I, those who've thought about it a lot more than I have, because I've usually gone with the client. But again, I was always more interested in the way the building's sited and the way the light was brought in and the way it worked with nature and those things. My house, which I guess most people think is the only building I ever did. And the same story. I mean, the light, the filtered light, the modeled light, the changing of the day from north, south, east, and west, the times when it darkens and you get a little piece of light and the green pops differently. I mean, all these things are real important. That's it's a kinetic element of life. And what drove me crazy in the postmodern period, and what drove me out of this place, was going back in time. I mean, I started with a Beaux-Arts school. I started with sumi washes. I started with shades and shadows. But I came a long way from there in these years. I haven't entered education yet. I'm still working my way to understand whether I'm ready to teach anybody anything. But when people started to draw interiors and showing how the light would be in that space, I couldn't believe it. I mean, that's light at 1 minute in the day. You know, how it penetrates that room one time during the day. You've got 24 hours of different light. If you're going to do that seriously, you've got to make a zillion drawings, and then you don't know what the hell you've got anyway. I mean, so you're kidding yourself. There's a process in which I think many people went through this idea of making rooms, and now when you make the room, what does the light look like? And it was a lot about. I mean, they were beautiful drawings, saying very little. And I think, you know, I was lucky. I had the opportunity to experience these things in reality and not through the drawing. The drawing was not important. I mean, if you know architects like myself and John Lautner, I admire the way people draw, but we make quick sketches. These things are designed in an hour, 2 hours. I don't sit down until I'm ready to do it, and I do it quickly. And then, yeah, there's lots of hours afterwards that the staff and the office works on on details and building stuff up and working them over, but the ideas are fast. And as long as I taught, I used to tell students, in my class, you don't have to be here 15 weeks. You don't have to be here over 1 week. I'll give you the problem. If you can solve the problem in 5 days, solve the problem in 5 days. If you can do it in 5 days and make a model the next week and do your drawings in 2 weeks, go to the beach for 13 weeks. Don't belabor the process. All you do is keep mucking it up. You change it and change it and change it. And I'm the only one who thinks like this, because I know teachers who I consider better than myself, and certainly in getting product, don't let you work that way. You're chained to your board, whether you've got anything to draw or not, you're chained there. And I really experienced this when I went over to Vico and taught in the villa. And I could be with the students night and day, which was a wonderful experience. And I would go upstairs at 10 o'clock at night and talk to the students and look at their work. And I'd go down, either we'd go out and have some food or go to bed or whatever we were doing. And I'd get up in the morning, I'd go back in the place, and I was amazed. I mean, night after night after night, these people were up, working, and the next day there was nothing on the table. And I was wondering, I couldn't believe it. I would say, next day I'd say, do me a favor, go down to the lake, take a swim, take a walk, do anything, but don't work like this. You're not accomplishing anything. Think about the project, think about the way you want to do it, then come up and do it. And don't do it this way. Now, some of us maybe are these kind of people. I mean, what's good for me ain't necessarily good for you, but that works for me, it works for a lot of architects, and everybody works their own way. Some people work through model, some people explore. Certainly people have done a lot better work than I do by this exploration process. I mean, the work of Morphosis and the way that they think about it and work at it and develop it, and others who work in that vein who are here, I think is wonderful. But I can't work like that. I just have to go in, sit down, do it, and then take a walk, go sit out, get outside, whatever. I just can't work in a continuous run like that. And I don't think you have to. I mean, these aren't projects that aren't thought about, but they're thought about in a different way, that's all. I mean, if I ever told you how these were designed, you wouldn't believe it, you know. And I trust a lot to luck. I mean, you know, what nature will do for me. You know, how the sun's going to play. What are the residuals? You get a lot of residuals that you don't even have to think about, that are marvelous, you know. Now, so if I drew that drawing on the right side of sitting there in the cave, and there's my light, and that's my drawing, and I say that's my space. But that's not my space. That space changes, as I said before. The space on the left changes. That piece of light on the fireplace, that's just there for the moment. It won't be there the next time. It'll be something different. And I'll try to move on, not belabor all this, but this is one in which the roof is used, as any of you know that have been out to my place. And I get then the advantage of all the trees in the whole neighborhood, and so I have my little site of 100 by 150, but I get, I don't know, 100 acres of trees, and I love that. Some other construction processes now which were different from the ones that I just showed you before. This is a combination of using the tower unit and then pre-cutting and pre-fabricating wood in much the manner that you would do with steel. And all of what you see here was craned up in one day on the left and then infilled over time. And if I would have been smart in those days, I would have left it like that on the left, and I would have been the first deconstructivist. I would have beaten Daniel Libeskind by quite a few years. but I wasn't that smart, and I thought the bracing should come down. And so, but the spaces were made by the structure, and I think structure makes pretty wonderful spaces, and I think people are once again understanding that and realizing that. And for a while, it was another put down of modern architecture. Modern architecture was about structure and not about anything else, and that's crazy. So sometimes wood can be glorious, I think. It's nice. And then this was another one that was fabricated on the ground and craned into space. Today this is fairly typical. I mean, cranes are used much more. In the days when I was doing this, cranes weren't used that much in residential work. They were used in commercial, as you know, and industrial, but not very much in residential. So we were always looking at ways that we could quicken the process, because I was always thinking that the time would come when maybe I'd have the opportunity to build these things. That was always my dream, if you will. The belief was that it would occur. And because it isn't, I don't think I would call that a fantasy, but it's just a dream that didn't come true. Anyway, this has been infill later. Some of the same kind of mentality. And then I explored my cubes like most everybody else at one point in time, again for repetitive systems. And it starts up here with a variety of cubic spaces, which is usually not the way I begin anything. This is for the first time probably where I designed where it was a priori the group before had a certain amount of that to it because it was repeat and exploration of a single idea. But here I was starting with the cube. Okay, so then they were varying heights, same dimension. And this is again a deconstruct of a sort. You take out the four sides and it leaves you the four corners. And then I pulled out the corner because there were a lot of nice trees, and I thought it would be nice to have the contrast of the slit versus the larger space. And then I added on the extra baggage, which are the opposite of what I was doing before, but if we look over here on the red, it's a little easier, but the things like the kitchen, the baths, the wardrobes, the fireplaces, the skylights, these were all add-ons, and the orange, of course, is the circulation tie, and it could be made of a series of these things endlessly in whatever direction you want to go. Herman Hertzberger showed you how you could do this endlessly if you're aware of his project in Holland. That was a wonderful commercial building that based on the same kind of mentality, and you'd be amazed with a simple process like this, the kind of volumetrics and the kind of spaces that can be developed. Also, Kahn of course was doing this stuff, and so some of us were picking up that mentality during those years, and so we were now starting to learn a little bit from the East and from people around the world other than our own selves in California. We also turned these 45 in order to get views to the waterfront in a couple directions. The baggage here again is a little bit different, but has some of the similar mentality. And that ended up being projects like this, in which the one contractor actually took one of the bays and built all these panels and beams and laid them all down, and then we craned them all up, and then it made a house like this. And that house then had interplay of spaces. It didn't hold true to the diagram in that really the spaces where the fireplace is and so forth should have been made out of another material and more of a lighter material that could be tacked on, but the owners wanted to have more continuity, and so I went along with that, but the idea was the other one. And then the 45-degree turn one ended up like this down at in Naples area of Long Beach. I'll go into this a little later more when I go back to some of my energy discussions. By the way, it was interesting to hear people talk about energy again a little bit. This is much more of a vertical place. And I also, during these years, did industrial work, much more simple, but the idea here was really to understand tilt-ups and precasting. The one you see on the left, building on the right is kind of a low-rise building that I did, but it was the idea there was really that I was working with a precast. I don't usually show this one, but I will tonight, just going to showing everything. But it was an idea of a column support vertical system, which were precast and precast concrete in this direction. The use of, again, a concrete precast trellising that worked through, so it had some of the mentality of what I was doing. This period was kind of interesting because it was sort of a what I would call pre-postmodern period in which we as architects again began to look at, I mean, we developed the ability to skin very well, commercial buildings. By this time, the systems had been developed, and so in the early 60s, architects began to look at going back to concrete and other methods of doing this because they got tired of using the same skins over and over. And they also started to think of the same kind of things that postmodernists began to worry about, and that was a building, when it has a top of some sort to it, it has a little better expression of a bottom, and it even has things up on the roof, like in this case a recreation center for this particular building. And it isn't one of my proudest moments, but it did have some of those same ideas that later came back, and so like about 15 years later, except that they began to be talked about more historically as tripartite buildings and so forth and so on. And I don't know. And also there was at this point in time, which was different than now, concrete buildings, concrete structures of up to 11 stories was an economical way of building. With the earthquake codes later, these buildings all became steel buildings. And now I'll talk a little bit about planning, and you're in for a long night, and I hope you can put up with this. But during this, after 10 years of working, and during this period of time, by the way, I probably did about 60 houses. I did about 10 multiple units, about 10 commercial buildings, and about a half a dozen industrial buildings. And that was sort of my first 15 years of work. And but after 10 years of working and where I felt a little more comfortable with what I was doing, I wasn't getting to do some of the planning and the big ideas that I really liked, because I like to think in bigger terms. I became involved with urban design issues in Los Angeles, and actually in the early 60s, a group of us, about half a dozen of us in the AIA, got together to do several studies. The first was a land planning study that I'll go into a little bit later. Another was a question about the rapid transit that was being proposed, the 4-corridor system that we're in the process of building under today. I'll go into that a little bit more. A gray area study, which was really taking a look at Los Angeles, at the areas that were tending downward, and what were the methods of maybe turning that around. And then in the mid-60s, we had a new planning director, Cal Hamilton, and he came into the city and started a whole goals council, a whole goals report. And in those days, most of the people on that goals council were made up of architects, planners, and a certain number of citizens. And we did a study of the city, and they sent out people to various areas of the communities and tried to get back information that they could begin to devise a plan for the city of Los Angeles. And out of that, 4 concepts were looked at, and this group of consultants, if you will, and people ended up with sort of the obvious centers concept for the city of Los Angeles, because it was automatically a city of many existing centers already. So that's where we begin. And as a counter to that center's concept, a few of us also had this idea about transportation and another way of using the freeways for the transportation routes other than adding another system of four quarters transportation upon it. And this center concept really dealt with centers at the intersection of the freeway grid rather than really, in this case, usually more in the center of the grid. And it was sort of a reversal. The commercial or higher intensity and industrial would take place here. The schools and the community services of that nature would be more in the center, and the housing would be around that. Also, we posited an idea, a different transportation mode altogether. My feeling always was that a four-quarter system and a fixed rail was not really the right idea for Los Angeles because we were such a matted city and so spread out. And so we thought that individual transit made a lot more sense. And I don't know if any of you caught the article in the paper last Saturday, but there was an article that was talking about a way of alleviating the amount of traffic or the amount of buildup on the freeways by now incorporating a system that was developed in 1939 by General Motors and by Ford Corporation, which was a method of guiding vehicles so that they could drive much closer together. And when I was 12 years old, I went to the New York World's Fair in '39 where this was shown to us, and I remember being very much impressed by the idea that you could use a radar control or a control system that would allow you to pack cars tighter together and more safely. And later as a family, when we went back to General Motors, in later years, I was impressed once more by this idea and kept wondering why we weren't incorporating it. So number one, at this point in time, we said, why not incorporate a technology that's already known? Number one, it could increase the freeway load by 3 times immediately. In other words, instead of 3,000 cars per hour per lane, we can now get 9,000 cars. That would probably solve the problem and we'd be finished. But we went further with that. We said, why not make a vehicle that's really made for 1.2 passengers, which is what really you have in most of the cars, and reduce it to 1/4 to 1/6 the size of the cars that we have, and immediately we would now increase the capacity by 10 times or per lane, or get 30 cars per hour per lane. And it seemed to me that would solve all our problems. That would be fairly simple. And if we used this other method, that would make it simple. And then, of course, if we knew the computer was going to solve everything else, so if you computer guided these things, you could probably even do a better job than that. And so it seemed to me, by switching to electric cars, not having cars owned by people, but where we really leased all these little vehicles, so that the money that you pay now for your monthly payments in insurance and everything else just went into the whole system. We'd have plenty of money to pay for the system, and then your Rolls Royces and your Mercedes and your Porsches and whatever you have, you pick those up on the outside of town like you do your yacht and your jet, and you take your rides that way if you wanted to have that experience. But in town, you used another whole vehicle system. Anyway, we actually tried to push this with the state legislature, with think tanks, with aerospace companies, but we were naive enough. Obviously the automobile corporations weren't ready for this. Neither was the petrol, the oil companies, because we were talking electric cars. We weren't talking oil guzzlers, and we had a whole range of ideas about this, including how you would get the car out of the neighborhood, it would give us back the roads, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so there were a lot of planning aspects to the process. In the gray area study, oh wait, I've got to reverse that. We were doing a lot of simple things like this area that you see here now, which is around the rail area of downtown LA and the LA River that you see on the along here. And this is the rail area. This is I think Civic Center, Little Tokyo, and all the key spots around the city. These railroad yards back in the early 60s were already not being used as fully as we thought they should be. And so we just proposed that we develop a walkway system for starters that people could ride around in, look at the trains, experience the trains that were in place, come to the river, and just use it that way until it had the potential to be used in housing development or however else it was going to get used for higher intensity. And we also proposed at that time, which I think is on this slide. Oh wait, I'll come back to that afterwards. We also proposed a damming of the river, which I'll show you, like you see there, in which we would use inflatable dams at the two ends of the river, and it could be used for recreation. And of course, at the same time, it could be used for storing water and using water, and there's all kinds of other uses. We took this to the city council. They were actually interested in the idea, and went as far at least to talking to the Corps of Engineers, who said it was an impossibility. You can't use inflatable dams, and you can't do this kind of a thing, and it would destroy the flood control. And God, they had a million reasons why not. But it was interesting, about a year or two when we did the river study, they came back in and said in that discussion that they now had an idea for inflatable dams. And so you have to be patient when you're involved with positing ideas for planning in the city, because they usually take about 20, 30 years to come back into place. This was part of the gray area study where we went into a neighborhood like Echo Park, and here we were looking at the housing stock as it existed and the streets as they existed. And in this area you have alleys and streets. And so back to my old Greenbelt, I'm from the Mumford age, but where we were going to take the alleys and all the guest parking and the people would come to the units off the alleyways. The streets would then be closed and be used for play and for the use of the kids and families. I don't know how this would fly today in gray areas where there's as much drug-related and crime-related aspects going on. I think today ideas like this I'm not sure of anymore, whether they would help the situation or worsen the situation. But at that time we found it just interesting exercises for us. This was the land use study. This is what developers obviously were doing to the hills in those days. As architects, I think one could look at that and say it's quite handsome. But at the same time, I think I'll opt for nature. And we did at that time, and we looked at this from a standpoint of taking the same amount of development that they were proposing, and we came up with a roadway systems, a whole litany of ideas on how you should develop roads in the hills. We tried to develop a neighborhood of single-family, multiple dwelling, high-rise that would give them more development than they had by padding it out for only individual housing, and leave all the rest of the land to nature. And so we brought these ideas to the city and to the planning department in order to make them be, interested in trying to stop this kind of rampant development. About this time, those of us who had been working in the 60s on these kinds of projects, we used to do this instead of doing competitions. We would be really like urban design advocates, and we'd come together once a week and talk about these things and draw them up and write a little book and present them around the city. And we'd get involved with trying to put together things like Action for Better Los Angeles Environment. And over about a half a dozen years, we got to like each other. And so about late 60s, we developed a partnership, and Rex Lottery and Herb Kahn and myself became the partners, and Bill Simonian, who's here, and Claudio Boccato became the associates in our firm. And we took this group and we developed what we called a planning collaborative. And this collaborative was made up of a whole group of landscape architects, psychologists, sociologists, planners, etc. We had Chris Alexander, who was going to be part of our process. We were up in San Francisco and down here. Our thinking was really to see if we couldn't be more competitive in the planning arena with some of the large firms and get work that way. And so this whole collaboration idea became interesting. The idea that individual designs and individual products weren't so important, but what was important was collaboration and development of interdisciplines and so forth. And so our group started this, and we also had our little offices going at the same time in one location. And we would work on jobs like these that we would get. That some would be housing. This one on the right is an industrial planning system. The one on the right was an open space and conservation project for San Clemente. We were doing overlay systems and pointing out sites that could be used for development and setting up sites that could be used primarily for conservation. And we also had an opportunity to do our little new town. This was one out towards Valencia, and it was a fairly hilly site, and it was almost like an industrial town. The housing was in the hillside and also in the flatter areas. Commercial area was in the center. This little rail system ran through and over to a point up here, which is really the industrial part of it. And the system was, again, a downhill system that allowed the cars to park underneath, the units to view out, etc. And had some European aspects to it, or Hilltown aspects to it, in which local kinds of things like little markets, restaurants, and so forth would be in these little plaza areas up and through the units. And so that was our opportunity to do that. So at this point in time, now I enter education. And I got a call one day and somebody said, would you like to come out and share the program out at Pomona? And I had done a little bit of teaching, just some guest teaching at USC, and the opportunity to go out to Pomona was kind of appealing to me because it was a rather unique opportunity. They had a landscape program in place, they had an urban planning program in place, and architecture was just an embryonic option in the urban planning program. And they wanted to develop an environmental design school. And the idea of the collaboration was truly appealing because I had been through this process now of coming to that conclusion myself that I wanted to be involved that way. And to be the third leg instead of the first leg, when I went to Berkeley, they also had an environmental design program, but architecture was really the large leg of that program, and landscape and planning were quite minor by comparison. And here we had a chance to equalize. And so I took the challenge, which was interesting to me, and also at that time I felt for the first time in my architecture, which I showed you back before, that I was sort of at one with my work. I really felt comfortable with who I was and what my work was about, and I felt that maybe it was time that I could exchange some ideas with students because I felt comfortable enough and centered enough that I could, wasn't threatened or had to be threatening. And I also liked the idea that at this point in time, sort of a new language was being spoken in architecture. It was about methodology, the way that you would take the objective and put it together with the subjective, and you made buildings that were a little more scientifically thought about and discussed. And so all of these ideas appealed to me, and having looked at the program at USC and seeing its faults, I thought possibly I could maybe do a better job than we were doing there, and particularly where we could do this interdisciplinary thing. So Michael kind of took you through that story a little bit. We came in, I think we were a very ambitious program. I think we were excited, and I had a lot of energy in those days. I had the opportunity to hire people. I think I was fortunate in hiring, I think, people who were more energetic than I was. And the whole team really became very strong. And I think what we began to do out there was exciting and was going quite well. The difficulty that occurred only was administratively, in a sense. We grew. When I started there, we had 35 students in the option, and in 3 years we grew to 350. Each year I had to build new architectural offices for myself and for staff. Plus we had to teach all the core courses and all the difficult part of the program, and at the same time argue with the dean about not making our program get bigger than the other programs, because otherwise we no longer would be able to communicate the way I wanted to, because as soon as we were bigger, we were going to be more powerful. If we were more powerful, I wanted more money. If we had more money for our program, we were now going to have a major problem with the other two disciplines. And when we try to do projects together with landscape and planning, and we had the age-old problem of the landscape architects and the planners always making themselves subservient to architects anyway. They always thought the architects were the better designers. While in school, as soon as you get out of school, that whole thing turns around when you go to the planners and the building departments and so forth. And now you're on the other end of the stick. But in school it was the other way, and I was trying to actually break that down. I had gone through this when I was in Berkeley on similar kind of projects, and I really wanted it here to be more equal and together. What finally broke the program was the fact that the administration wanted to use architecture to develop more students and more money for the university as a whole. And we were being used, in my opinion, rather than the idea that we were there to build a program. And actually, later on, when we broke down and had this little discussion in which I called the dean into my office and told him what I thought of him. And he asked for my resignation. And I found that the school's agenda at the university and I think our agenda was quite different. We wanted to make what we thought would be, believed could be one of the best schools in the country. And they didn't care too much about that. They were more interested in a school. Let me go back. That was about a different thing. I want to go back to these. They wanted a school that was, just a school. So these little rhombic dodecahedrons were, I guess it was a combination of, Glenn Small and my idea together. I don't remember even how it comes. I think when you do things just like in an office, sometimes you forget whose idea everything is. But in the first year, we were always building inflatables and various things anyway, but we started this project as a multiple. One, it was to build a unit out of plywood. It was a one-person unit. We were going to build them into a megastructure. We were going to do a behavioral study. We were going to put them on the campus. and have our students live in them for about 4 to 5 weeks. I'm a very naive guy, but this was sort of the dream, and the students were all into this thing, and we got about this far when everything started blowing up at the school. But this was sort of the rallying place. We'd usually go out there and talk about what should we do. I was ready to quit and go back to practice. I didn't need this, and the other guys thought, let's not do that, and we started talking further, and pretty soon we decided one day, let's start our own place. And the students said, yeah, 150 of them signed up very quickly that they wanted to get out of Pomona, and they're going to come over here with us. And we had an evening like this where we came and had a party, and people signed up and kind of committed, and Glenn and Tom Main and Jim Stafford and Simonian and Shelley and Adi, and guys like Michael there and Dean and a whole bunch of guys we got into this thing of let's make this place, and we decided if we get 50 of those students out of 150, we had enough to begin. So that's sort of the story, and we moved over to SCI-Arc, and this is what it looked like at the time that we leased it. The students began tearing it apart. Drescher had all this wonderful electrical service in there that I think the students got rid of in about one day, and he never let me forget it. He kept saying, you're still going to have to replace that electrical when you guys leave, and you guys are ruining my building, and so forth and so on. But anyway, the students really got into this thing, took the place apart, and then started the rebuilding. And at that time, we were the new school first. We wanted to be the new school, and we also had the acronym SCI-Arc as a backup. But here you're seeing one of the early senior motley crew. Not all seniors, some of them were beginning guys, but we were making panels, and these were in the old system, and the guys devised this panel system. Then they'd drive the car on to press them, and this was always Mike's favorite photograph. He still carries it around in his wallet. I think it's wonderful. Wait, what happened there? I lost one. I don't know if I'm ahead or not. Okay, and gradually this whole system with the rhombic dodecahedrons became what this space was filled with. And these spaces, the space used to look like this at one time. It was sort of this flexible, we thought it was going to be flexible, take it apart, change it, whatever we wanted to do with this system. And they were owned by the students. I don't know how much you know about the history of this place, but we came in here spending, $0. Shelley and I put up the last month's rent on the lease, but the rest of it was, or 2 months, whatever we had to do, but the rest of it, we didn't spend $1. The students came in and spent their own money to build their own place. They were part of the process of decision making. The beautiful part here was that we could throw away all the old ideas. At Pomona, we had to work around the system. In other words, a good administrator takes the system and works around it. It's like construct, deconstruct. It's like order, disorder. You take part of what's there and you do what you can do to make the changes you can make. And this was always sort of part of my personality anyway. When we moved here, though, we had a great opportunity, a second great opportunity that very few people have had in their life. And one was start all over again, but this time we could throw away the book. And we sat down with the students between April and October, and we did establish a curriculum that, that everybody thought was pretty good. It seemed to cover all the ideas. We wanted to have, we had a double studio idea at that time. We felt students should work on smaller projects and social or city projects at the same time. So they were supposed to do a planning project or a urban design project or a community design center mentality kind of project, and also do a studio project. They also were to take a series of courses, and I think we only had about 4 requirements out of this whole process, but you could kind of put your program together the way you wanted. And we were interested really finding out what was the best way to develop a program empirically. What would happen if you left it alone, you went with it, you allowed things to happen, what kind of a program would finally evolve? In a place that somebody I think referred to last week as a hole in the wall, but I have always thought of it as a great space, and I agree with Bucky Fuller, who came in here when we first opened it up and said, God, this is the best learning environment I've ever been in, and anywhere I've been around the world. And I think that was closer to the point, in that you needed a place that people could wreck. You don't want it to be pristine. You want a place that can go up and go down and change over time. And that's what this place was about. It was about ideas that could change, and it was about a place that could change, and it didn't have any static qualities to it. I'm automatically a yay-sayer. I like to say yes to everything. I like to put things, run them up the flagpole. I like to see what flies. The good things will stay. You get rid of the bad things without any problem at all. You don't have to worry about those. They'll go away. It's sort of an improvisation. It's similar to Richard's jazz playing, I guess. I think we played SCI-Arc, something like that. And the space was always dynamic here. In fact, in a way, it was a little more dynamic when we could go on the second level, because when you'd talk, you'd have students hanging over the top of you, and then it really kind of intensified what went on here. But it was a point in time that the fire department finally caught up with us and kept putting us out of business and making life difficult. But we had quite a few years before they caught up with us. And they were kind of wonderful years, and it was fun, and it was fun watching the process change. And people used to wonder, how is this place run? Well, we ran it in a way that, I think that's the best way to run a place, when people don't understand it, how it's happening. And that's sort of was always my style. The other great thing was that guys like Glenn and Adi could get these students jazzed up to run all over the city on bike trips and tents and sleep out overnight. And one student would have an idea, they want to build a pyramid, and they'd go find these plastic rods, and this pyramid went all over hell. It went back to Washington, D.C., and it was built up on the mall in Washington, and it was sort of SCI-Arc's first statement into the east of the Mississippi for them to know who we were. We would take these things out to sites and set them up, and it was kind of a fun first year of running people all around and getting them away from their traditional way of thinking into another way of thinking. And sometimes they were socially concerned ideas, and sometimes they were ideas like this that I would have design and flexibility and a lot of kind of nice things that were, 60s and 70s ideas. I think they're coming back in 90. When we knew we wanted to do that, once again, a few of us, again led by Glenn and Adi and I guess myself, went and started looking around for land that we could maybe purchase where we could build these things out on the site, and students could go out and experiment and maybe build experimental structures out there. So we found this really great piece of land, 120 acres out in Topanga overlooking the ocean, and we were trying to encourage kind of a research center, a fun center out there. And for a while it worked, and then people started to lose their energy. I don't know. And then it just sort of sat there, and the ideas began to change, and nobody was too much interested anymore. And so the land, at that point in time, we started our European program. It started first in other places in Europe and then gradually we in about 82, 83, we bought the villa. And we thought in the place where it was in the Ticino, which is really kind of the heart of rationalism, and not very far from Milano, that students could go over and study for a semester and begin to understand rationalism, some of the postmodern ideas, some of the symbols that were being displayed and talked about in the proper context. And so I thought this would be a wonderful experience for that, and some of the others did. I also thought it would be a great opportunity for some of our faculty to rotate out of here and have some time over there, which would allow us to bring in new faculty here. I didn't think we should expand our program here, but it would be better to do it in outreach programs. And so it was for a variety of reasons that VICO began. And the problem that happened for me was that with this very heavy rationalist thinking that goes on or went on at VICO, which I think is very valid because, you know, rationalism and expressionism will always exist. Classicism will always exist. These are parts of architecture. It's not either or. All these things are coexisting. And the problem with the fight I have with certain faculty members here, they only think what's important is where their head is at any point in time. And I don't know when they'll become mature enough to understand that these ideas have existed forever. And they will continue to exist, and they will continue to go around in cycles. And you as young people have to understand that too, in that your 5 years here, your 4 years here, your 3 years here are a point in time. And when you leave here, your point in time it'll change. And what you learned will not necessarily be the end all. It's only a beginning. It's only a part of the process. And if you don't understand the whole process, you're only getting the pieces and the parts. But anyway, that's what VICO was meant to be about. And it's quite a wonderful place. And unfortunately, not enough of you, I think, take advantage of it. Back to the more mundane, which is our practice of architecture, which was going on in planning. We also were involved during this period of time, again, with working on CBDs and trying to beautify little cities and bring them up. I don't necessarily agree with this approach totally, but I always felt that cities should be places should be more dynamic. I argued in our firm that this is Inglewood, it's the place of Hollywood Park, it's the place of the Forum, it's en route to the airport. This should be a place that's loaded with bars and restaurants and hotels, and we shouldn't be trying to upgrade through a beautification process of banners and trees and nice little awnings a city and try to make it continue to exist. And I think as long as we go into the city and try to do this, it's only a staying action. I think we have to be much more dynamic about what we do in these places. We also did a study for the Santa Monica Mall when they were trying to do their linkages to the parking structures that you see in yellow, and we proposed a series of linkages to a little people mover system because the DOT was financing this to the study. Santa Monica Place, and so it was running back and forth here, and we were tying in from this point, and the Department of Transportation was going to finance it all. Anyway, it was a study, and it went a little further than that into these are just ways to get into the place, and then we did other studies around for traffic and so forth, and we also were the prime urban designers and leaders of the people mover system for the city of Los Angeles. So, over the years I've been involved with transportation planning as well as a whole variety of other planning. But these were all projects that I guess were more, I'm not even sure they were our dreams. They were somebody else. They were dreams. It's interesting to me when you are an advocate, you can do what you want to do, which is one of the beauties of at that point in time, you really look inside of yourself, and we were about ready to quit the project altogether, but we continued on to see what the evaluation would be. It ended up that the bus system and the automated guide system were about equal, and so we went ahead to do this program. And this program one was an automobile bus intercept. And also trying to enliven it with this little amphitheater units that would have food and exhibits and so forth, so that our illustrious attorneys and judges and so forth and criminals could come out into the middle of this mall and communicate with each other. We also wanted to develop a overpass between the plaza and the mall, and then continue the connection back across and over to City Hall. So we did that. We also took the busiest walking street of Los Angeles, which we wanted to make a proposal for that instead of widening the sidewalks to the sides, which were being studied, that we would actually come in the center and use the concept of the Barcelona Rhombus, which is a very active, wonderful part of Barcelona, if any of you have ever been there, and in which you have a great number of kiosks, flower shops, people sitting, eating, and lots of wonderful things going on that certainly would work beautifully with our Hispanic population. The city took these and looked at them, and that was about it. Also, we did a study for the East Side in-town rehab that was also part of the station process. We were looking at the buildings that could be reused as housing, what could be used for potential community buildings, where we might introduce some additional commercial tree planting, what have you. I mean, we were always into those kinds of things. We went ahead and made landscape proposals for what would go around the stations near City Hall, and we're part of that process. Another one that was for Beverly Hills. This was a study for, I don't know if you know what a corporation yard is, but a corporation yard is a place where they take all the vehicles that service the city and they bring them into one place to service. And this was between Little Santa Monica and regular Santa Monica, in the area now that was industrial but was proposed to go into residential. And our job was to make proposals to them on how to handle this corporation yard. So our proposal was to take it underground several stories and raise the recreation field that could be used by the community as a whole and the housing that was going in, and introduce a community building. And that was part of that whole proposal. We also done industrial buildings. This is a water treatment plant in which we were consultants, and the idea here was to make the process of water treatment observable to the kids and to the people of the city, rather than hiding it behind walls. So this was adjacent to a park and part of a process that we put forward. We again, some more commercial and industrial work over time. And during the same period of while I was teaching here, I was going into another whole phase of my residential career, which was trying to come to grips with the energy code that was prescribed in mid-70s, and it meant my having to possibly change my whole thinking about California architecture. But I didn't really want to change that. They were asking for us to now have, as you know, a 20% glass area to floor area ratio, and my feeling about it was that I still wanted to have the glass that I had before, so I took the time to do a study of my houses that I had done over the years before, about 15 of them, and 5 houses of people in the same neighborhood who I could get in contact with, and I took their energy bills for a year, I correlated it against a whole series of ideas that were supposed to be, that energy was talked about, volume to area, the amount of insulation, orientation. I took off all the heat loss on all of them, and I went through the whole process. When I got through the whole thing, I found that most of my houses were more energy efficient than the conventional houses that were in the ratio that was being prescribed. And what I found was that the major idea was that the buildings that had high volumes facing south to southeast and southwest, that were getting a great amount of sun insolation during the day, were very energy efficient buildings. What would happen would the sun would sit at the ceiling, and as the temperature changes would take place, you'd get a radiation that would take place that would heat the unit, and at the same time you'd get convection air going against the cold glass front that would draw this around. So what you see on the left is a diagram of that last house that I showed over here, and when we designed this was actually a glass shading device. But when I analyzed it, this was about the most energy efficient of all the houses that I had done, and I didn't understand why, because it really had tremendous surface to floor area ratio. But so I went back and I analyzed it, and it was partly due to the fact that I was trapping heat in this place, so I minimized the heat loss. We were getting volume, the air going up, as I said. We looked at it from a standpoint of how we would cool it. If you added a fan, you could pull it back down, you could rock storage it. So this became one model that could be used. I then went through a whole series of ideas on what would happen formally if I began to use passive and active ideas in architecture. So this is one first idea, which was really not too dissimilar to the one you saw before, but now I'm on there was a piling system again that I needed. These were steel piles. There was a 45-degree turn in order to be oriented to the sun for the solar collectors. It was I used a series of greenhouse units and fireplace units that the owner wanted that were water-filled in order to deal with the water mass. So instead of getting the mass out of the concrete and out of other heavy materials, I was getting it out of water. This one was about using land mass. This was a rock hill that I had in place, and so what we did here was develop that whole area as a greenhouse. And during the day we would collect the heat, and this circulation element was then closed off during the day, and at night it would be open and the heat would come in, as you see by these arrows, into the house, and we get the advantage of that rock mass. It also did another thing for me, was that you're probably all aware that on hillsides usually you have to stay 15 feet or half the height of a hill away from the base. By covering the hill like I was doing here, the city allowed me to go back and take my normal setback, and I could go right up against the hill. So there was a double advantage. This was on a site that viewed to the ocean, and not only was the rock hill used for the storage, it was also used as the datum, and really was sort of the generator of the form in combination with the other. Another one that was interesting to me was this one that was for a two-family use. There was a family that was going to use this front end, and they would come up through this stair, and then another family that was going to periodically use the back half. And so this again was organized around two circulation systems, site responsive. It stepped up the hill like my other work that you've seen did. And again, it had a bad soil condition. It was a piling, double beam, mechanical system, heat sink, and it was sort of a whole machine, with the idea that the solar collectors would also rotate in order to monitor the sun. I always liked this project, but it didn't go anywhere, so it's a dream that didn't come true. Again, this is one point in time when steel finally was cheaper than wood, and so I took that opportunity to convince a client that I should do a steel and glass house for them, which I was always trying to do, and steel and glass and greenhouses and all those good things, and that didn't go. And here was another one that was kind of an exciting site, and it was again an opportunity to use a bridge house in which I could use steel trusses. The vertical support systems were all at these stairwells that were either steel or concrete vertical supports with the stairs coming around them, the trusses spanning to those. The solar the hinging and the rotating of the grids took place so that these were sun-oriented. The solar collector formed the roof, and the north side sun came in through the back. And so, again, it was part of a design that was technologically, in a sense, a machine to work with sun. And unlike my early work, which was very simple in its idea, which maybe was better, which was just a way of taking large overhangs and trellises and simple ideas, this was about heat sinking and active systems and passive systems and all kinds of other stuff. So sometimes maybe you get more sophisticated than you have to. And then the owners wouldn't let me do it in steel, and so this ends up being a wood house. Again, the laminated beams, the siding, and the gallery, which was the art gallery connection between the master bedroom and the living room, became a wood place, but a different attitude. Not what I really wanted, because it was heavier and not as light. And worked again with a lot of things I already knew about. Another one for a downhill site was, again, a structure in which these round units were the concrete supports. This was a concrete beam between the two, which was also a catwalk. It supported the truss system that you see here that goes up to that point. It went into the hill. This is a greenhouse. The heating took place here and was collected in this mass, in the concrete mass of the wall, the rock storage, the idea of it feeding back in, the exhaust system. And so this whole process for me was one of invention, exploration in ideas that might work for energy response. And that was the plan. And another one that was a linear one with a tank using the greenhouse, the solar collector, etc. And this house at that time didn't go. I had the opportunity to do a place in Denver, and on this site was stepping up in a similar manner to the one that I had designed before. So I used a similar mentality there to develop, again, the solar collecting, the tower unit, which was the water collector, the viewing study, and the fireplace unit was part of this whole set. And this one, I had a client who this time wouldn't buy wood. They wanted it to be a white house, so that was fine with me. So this was a plaster house. Totally, the intent was that the grounding piece, unlike most of the sites that we get here in California, which were more constricted, I had a large site, and I wanted to define my landscape places like I showed you here with ground walls, and they were to be made out of adobe, but adobe became more expensive than doing it out of block, so we did it out of block. And so those were out of the material of the color of the ground, and the white was really the color of the snow in the wintertime. And so this house has, different from what I have here, experiences of winter and summer, and has many fewer trees around it, so it's not the same experience that I had in Southern California. And here I use more the skylighting to develop the patterns and the changes in some trellising. The first house I showed you now is being constructed, but not so much as an energy house, and it's in construction now. And so sometimes you have to wait for 10 years, so you don't have to keep changing style all the time. You can still live with stuff you did 10 years ago, at least I can, and it has certain changes from what we were doing before. In this house probably will be complete in a few months, hopefully. This was a one-off, kind of a strange thing, probably the hardest house I ever had to design for me, because it was the first time I really had a site in a flat place in Santa Monica. And the context was difficult for me. It was the first house on the block that was going to break the height limit that had been, that most houses were one story. This was now had an opportunity to go 35 feet high. The people at this point in time had paid a lot more money for their land, and they wanted to take advantage of the full envelope. And I was having a very difficult time with that because I knew there was no chance of it really being in context. But I made an attempt to drop the right side to the smaller house, the other side to the bigger house. I took the garage to the front to try to also diminish the height. But all of this was really not too much avail. And really the house originally was designed really as an all plaster, no steel exposed like you see on the left. But what happened is, and I also thought that I had enough shear wall in the vertical viewing element. At this point in time, I designed it and I went off to Europe, and the engineer came in and said I didn't have enough shear wall, and he added all these rigid frame fragments, and the office didn't want to change the original diagram, so this frame started to take the place of these railings and these kind of funny things, that he did. And it's a really strange rigid frame. Many of you know anything about structure. You end up with a thing that's really decomposed in a sense, as it's supposed to express rigidity. And this whole idea fascinated me when I arrived back in town. Just those four corners were up. And so I asked the owner if I could strip the plaster off of those, because I liked those four pieces that the engineer had designed, and I felt that they should be expressed. So it wasn't a big constructivist act. It was really about finding something on the site that I didn't know was going to be there. The 45-degree turn, again, on this one is related to the fact that the sun and most of our grids are really 45 degree to a north-south axis through a large part of our city, and so quite often you have an automatic 45-degree grid turn. And of course one movement in a grid does put a place in motion, and so this one is a little strange vocabulary-wise for me, but it came out of a process of thinking about energy, solar, an internal garden in a city where I had to close the sides off, and we came in planting avocado trees and citrus, which didn't make it over time, but it was, again, a bunch of other ideas that I tried to play with. And then I was back again with a project that had a potential for component use and repetitive use on Beverly Glen. So this was a whole new series of ideas of add-ons for privacy and for energy. And this didn't go, but it eventually went into a house that you see here that was about a north-south axis. The south being completely open, the east-west wall being the wall that took the energy passively, a skylight at the back that got to the north side in order to get some heat into that back side, but primarily a closed north side and open south side. It was for an Iranian who wanted it to be in concrete or concrete block. So again, it's a different idiom for me. Shows you kind of the way the diagram works with that wall that cuts through the middle of it all. a lot more fluid than some of the things. Series of solar collectors through here, a roll-up, roll-down screen that was European kind of process that is used for controlling the amount of sun that we get into this area. The wall that was to take the sun, the diagram that shows how the sun reaches the back wall and moves into it that way. I sometimes talk about these things as construction systems and energy systems, but there's a little bit of design decision making going on here too. The wall that takes the heat. All the other things we take for granted, the interplay of space, the glass stair that lets the light come down through the center core, that the entry comes sort of out of the bowels of this building and moves up through to the top. Well, the right doesn't go with the left, but anyway, and then the two the duct that takes the heat down and the duct that takes the heat up, and that whole process of showing this kind of stuff. And this house is down Manhattan Beach, and it also had to do with energy and motion and movement and kinetics and a lot of other ideas. Once again, the grid shift here is for energy reasons. I go 15 degrees off, again, to be south-facing. There was a solar collector in this middle unit here. We had a pool on the roof. We had this sort of wave wall that takes in as much public space as we can, but basically it's your typical 30 by 90 beach site in which you fill 100% of it. You're looking at the plan of the roof and the plan of the upper level there and the model. The idea of the building was really one in which the back portion, the garage, the service, the pool area was all concrete and static. The front end was supposed to be all metal and steel and have the potential for motion. The screening systems were supposed to move. The privacy systems were supposed to move. And so it was my way of trying to get motion and movement in the process. What happened in the process, the owner wouldn't buy the metal skins, and I was forced back to wood again. So you can sometimes trap yourself in your life if you get off with certain ideas and materials. People keep moving back that way on you, and it's a little more difficult to move them in a direction that sometimes you would find better, because here I would find it to be a lot lighter and a lot simpler. But they liked the idea of teak when they went down to Salk Institute, and that's the way this developed. And I get into my art pieces too, so I'm joining up. Or trying to sometimes. Again, an all glass stair and glass rail, and working with the glass wall outside. And then I jump into this building, primarily because it also had several ideas to it. And it was about energy, it was about daylighting, it was about metaphor, obviously. It was a wonderful, for me this is a great context. The freeway, a mobile park, industrial pieces, bridge linkages. So we tried to pick up some of those parts and pieces and bring them back into the building in our way. It was also a bus element, so we wanted to have motion as much as we could. This is the diagram of how it works, really energy-wise. The horizontal fins that you saw are really daylighting elements, and they were, again, modulated so from as a seating point and a standing point. Lights brought in from the backside as well. Solar collectors are, again, turned 45 degrees because of the typical grid. Air scooping was done to scoop the ocean air, put them in a plenum, and feed it into the building. We had west fins to cut down the sun coming in from the west side. We allowed the west sun to come in certain portions because the upper floor of this was used for nighttime use. So the building was formally came out of all of those issues. And then they wanted the parking structure screened in. Originally it was open, and then we attempted to make it a piece of planting that would gradually grow down this element and sort of, again, sort of echo the green planting of the freeway that moves up to the freeway element. The fins and the turns and a certain amount of the motion that takes place by that, the scoops. Gymnasium for Loyola Marymount project that I wish would have gone ahead but never did. It was a cable structure, so structurally it was very interesting, in which it was supported and held down by the handball courts, the mass of the courts, and this air scooping system. It had airplane hangar doors that opened up and made this total theater. The old gymnasium was here. The linkage was a collector that would work for the pool at the entrance point. And so it was about a bunch of things. And looked like so from the ground, and in context with the old looked like this. And this again is the idea of really working counter to the old, which I think marries the old as well as trying to repeat the old. And I think respecting the proportions in our openings against those openings and counterplaying makes as good a marriage, if not better, than trying to marry it to an historic piece that does something else. I also had a chance to do a advanced technology house, and this was about another series of ideas which was meant to be mobile and changeable. This was the little vehicle unit that was electrically driven, and similar to the one that I had proposed for freeway systems earlier, it was to draw a unit that had the bath and kitchen and potential sleeping in it. So this was like a van. This would be like a miniature vehicle. This 14-foot diagram is not so dissimilar from my cubes before, but it was going to be out of plastic. It had the 4 opening ends. The idea was that these pieces could flip out in a variety of ways. The sides would drop down for decks. The top would pop up. The center could rotate and change. And so this was about a lot of kinetic ideas, as well as these other attachments. It's interesting. They've just come out with a vehicle now that does this, the van where you get the car that disengages. I always wondered why they didn't put one of these things together for wreck vehicles, because they're always pulling another car behind, which seems such a waste. And it seemed to me it was always better to break these things apart or attach them together to make a bigger thing. And then the wall was, the things I was recommending to NASA at that time was studies in a variety of wall types that would be double-layered transparent materials in which we would put in gases and fluids to change that. So these were ideas and dreams. This was one of my few campus buildings. I had much the same experience that John Lautner did. This was my proposal, which they had tremendous 80 mile-an-hour winds. They wanted to solve that problem, and so I created this sort of airfoil for that. It was for the behavioral departments. I tried to develop a series of small courts around which each department would develop, and this was for students to come to talk to faculty, and I wanted it to be a place that would, where you got out of that little stupid cubby hole that we usually that you had to sit in at universities, and could be a little more lively and so forth. I was also knocked down by, it had other ideas of energy. They wanted me to talk about energy, and so we had water systems that worked, a bunch of stuff. but I got knocked down by my campus head of construction, and I was bombed, and the building ended up being a typical 3-court building and fairly conventional, and that's probably my first and last campus experience. A restaurant that had a bowstring truss and first was designed with that building to remain almost done. Then it was decided that the building should go down, and so this truss was developed as a system of mechanical beam, upper member, a curve connector. It's kind of a strange trussing, but which would allow me a variety of ceiling types where they could either go, the ceilings could follow the curve to here, or they could flip up and skylight here. This whole area was raised and lower with glass, and it had a bunch of other stuff in it. But finally, the restaurateur and I didn't see eye to eye, and I got out of this job. This was a hotel idea I had down at the ocean, in which I'm always tired of going to hotels where when you go to the conferencing part, you're in the worst part of the building. You're always in the bowels, in these quiet, these closed-in spaces. So this was a whole green area that was the connecting element, but all of these were little meeting places and places where people could look down into, and these were going to be same thing, which had more glass and potential closure back and forth so that you could at least enjoy being at the sea. This whole side, the railings and parts of the balcony were all about solar collecting. It had a water spill on top of here that was about air conditioning and so forth. That also didn't fly. We continued to do industrial buildings. And I had the same industrial developer, and I had this one's still in the works, which might fly one day, although it got caught in the Malibu cityhood problem. But it was about doing tilt-up buildings and in using industrial processes for things like housing or hotel units. And so this one still might go. And these are a couple of buildings that are in process now or near completion, along with that other one I said, that are still part of the same mentality of my 60s work, but it brings on, they become bigger and they have other people keep wanting them larger than they were, and then we started adding new frames to it and new pieces. But originally the idea of it was a combination of wood and steel rigid frame, which was rather unusual. And then these later pieces of steel were, because the owner kept pushing it out, it started at 7,000 square feet, and then during construction it grew to 10. And so it's been kind of a happening. And but I'm used to happenings. I was part of this place, and so these things just go on. And I'm not sure if it's, but they're going. And that brings us up probably to the project that's in the office now. In 1986, both my two sons, Finn, who many of you might know, and Ron, who is about 6 years older and is up in San Francisco, joined me, and our firm became made up of the three of us and the people who work with us. And that's always, in my firm, it's never been more than 3 or 4 people, and today it's people like Tracy Stone, who I don't know if she's here tonight, and Joel Sherman and Scott Fajak, who is a student here. And this project is really one that's designed, I think, sort of by all of us together in various stages. Finn is heading it up as design lead on it, but everybody's had a little bit of hand in it, and it's going through a variety of changes. And the way the office is working now, each of us usually takes our own projects. Finn is doing about 3 or 4 projects of his own that are in construction now, that hopefully someday he can present to you here. You won't have to listen to me anymore.
and my older son is doing one up outside of San Francisco that's a little bit more in the attitude of my 60s work. And at the same time we're doing a development up there. I'm also very pro the architects being involved in development. We're doing an 11 unit, but trying to deal with lifestyles in a different manner. We're incorporating into this apartment unit daycare center, potential home office use that can be used in common, and a bunch of social spaces that has sort of a co-housing mentality about it. And we're doing it sort of as an experiment in housing type. And then there's this project, which I'll go through quickly with you, and this will be the end of the presentation. But we have a fantastic site down at Palos Verdes, and this goes down to the ocean below. And but between the coastal and the planning, they're holding us 50 feet back from the top of the slope. So we're unable to really get out design the building so you can see whitewater from any of the spots. So we have that added part to deal with. We also have from point of entry to point of where you begin to have the key part of the site, we have a very long bridging or walking, which also is interesting. So what we've done is we've come from street, bridging through, taking our parking underneath, and thinking was to enter the building from the top and go down through the middle and then come down that way. There was also the potential to stroll out of the building at ground level and go out a different way, or even come back this way. There's a wall that starts from the ground that comes through the whole site, cuts it in half, and really is sort of separating the more public side from the private side of the project. The main part of this project now, I think, incorporates a lot of ideas that we've used over time, only I think it brings it up to date in a better way. First, to go back to the whitewater idea, we were allowed to take a piece out to this point. So what we've done is we've bridged this piece out right to this point, but we've put it on a rotation. So we can take that rotation and get outside of our 50 feet by getting closer to that way. There was also the idea of developing a detractable or retractable unit that would sit in this point and then also pull out, and it could move around the site this way. We had, at the upper level of the bed, we had ideas of letting the bed come moving on out into the outer space so it could also move in and out. So we're developing kinetics, which have always been near and dear to me. Hopefully we can get some of them into this project. And some of the energy things are there too. It's really a square. It's a square within a circle, and there's two layers of glass. There's one that works the inside square, and there's a layer of glass that works the outside circle. And those can be open and closed independently, obviously. One is to have an indoor pool and an outdoor pool, and also be able to use that for mass. We're going to have a certain amount of greenhousing that can work, and be able to work it in that fashion. This whole unit is the children's and guest wing. It has its own indoor-outdoor play area. There's a gallery underneath, and a bunch of those kinds of things. And then there's the whole servants end of it that's at this place. And so that's kind of where we are at this point in time, and I will close now, but I'll give you two more words and get out of here, and I won't be taking any questions because I don't think you probably want to stay any longer. But what I'd just like to say to the students, if I may, since I don't talk to you very much anymore, is, as I said earlier, I think part of the reason I went into education is that I felt not enough architects were really socially, politically involved. They didn't care enough about what was going on in their city. And thank God, I think there's a little more interest today than was going on in the 60s when we first started in the city. And I don't think you should, I think you should all be concerned about that. We started ADPSR in this school, architects, planners and designers for social responsibility. It was an idea of a student. A student came to me one day and said, "Why aren't architects more socially involved?" And I said, "I can't answer that. I wish they were, and I don't know why they aren't." She says, "Well, why don't we start an organization for that?" I said, "Wonderful, you start it." And so she put together a group, and a group of us, few faculty members got together. She couldn't get any students involved. I think we had a handful. A few of them are here that continued to be involved, Marta Perlis, and probably a few others I can't see. But it was very difficult to get students caring about these things. Rosemary Rabin kind of took it under her wing, and we gave her the time to work on it here so that she could also build it. It's become a pretty big national organization. I think it's going to do more good now. At one time we were mostly about nuclear freeze, but I think now they're going to get into much more of the environmental and ecological issues, and I certainly invite more of the students to be part of that process. You'll learn a lot. You've got to learn the political process. I think you should learn the economic process, the way the economy works, the way development takes place. All of that is part of the thing. This bad-mouthing of the practitioner in the real world, I think that's bullshit. You've got to know those parts to be able to operate within it. I think, you can't be that. I mean, Michael talks about this thing of being the, how does he put it? I guess the, what do you call it, Mike? The kind of the guys who are in the bushes, beating the tribes out there, but he knows the political process, and he understands that, and it's guerrilla warfare. Okay, the guerrilla warfare of architecture is something you have to know about, and you have to know how to fight it intelligently, not just only by the seat of your pants. So I invite you to get more involved with that, if you so desire, because some of you won't. And the other thing I believe very, very strongly is try to understand who you are in the education process, in your working process. Try to understand just how much order and disorder you need in your life. What are your dreams and your fantasies? What are those things that make you go around? I know what mine are. And I think once you grab that and you understand that, it's the only time you can begin to make architecture. Prior to that, you're kind of going from fad to fad and thing to thing. And if you join a fad, you're always going to be there too late. The ideas have already been put down. And all of us are victimized by this. This up here has a little bit of that, or some of that. But it also has a lot of things that I think our firm and I've been about for many, many years too. The part that I don't like, it deals with too much money in the wrong place. I wish the money going there was going into public housing or into affordable housing or into other areas. But we have to use these kind of jobs to learn from, and to learn to be able to put them back in the community. So again, as I guess I said to graduating classes before, you may like to do little things or big things or combinations. Make your choice. Have your beliefs. Have your fantasies, if you will. And above all, I think, choose life and don't forget to dream. Thank you.
I'm going to ask you off the plate. So now, leaves out no time. Too well with it. I'm going. Hey, dead. 4. This is the radio. I just have the name under the headwind. The whole all your advice, all your analog, and I just agree and on page going through that. This all these, this kind of clear, on the back, side you need that. There's the looking at these two see on the rake, not proper, and all of the blanks do not bear on that. You cannot change what so that our key look down.
It was my way of trying to get motion and movement into the process. What happened in the process, the owner wouldn't buy the metal skins, and I was forced back to wood again. So you can sometimes trap yourself in your life if you get off with certain ideas and materials. People keep moving back that way on you, and it's a little more difficult to move them in a direction that sometimes you would find better, because here I would find it to be a lot lighter and a lot simpler. But they liked the idea of teak when they went down to Salk Institute, and that's the way this developed. And I get into my art pieces too, so I'm joining up. I'm trying to sometimes. Again, an all glass stair and glass rail, and working with the glass wall outside. And then I jump into this building, primarily because it also had several ideas to it. And it was about energy, it was about daylighting, it was about metaphor, obviously. It was a wonderful, for me this is a great context. The freeway, a mobile park, industrial pieces, bridge linkages. So we tried to pick up some of those parts and pieces and bring them back into the building in our way. It was also a bus element, so we wanted to have motion as much as we could. This is the diagram of how it works, really energy-wise. The horizontal fins that you saw are really daylighting elements, and they were again modulated, so as a seating point and a standing point. Lights brought in from the backside as well. Solar collectors are again turned 45 degrees because of the typical grid. Air scooping was done to scoop the ocean air, put them in a plenum and feed it into the building. We had west fins to cut down the sun coming in from the west side. We allowed the west sun to come in certain portions because the upper floor of this was used for nighttime use. So the building formally came out of all of those issues. And then they wanted the parking structure screened in. Originally it was open, and then we attempted to make it a piece of planting that would gradually grow down this element and sort of echo the green planting of the freeway that moves up to the freeway element. The fins and the turns and a certain amount of the motion that takes place by that, the scoops. Gymnasium for Loyola Marymount project that I wish would have gone ahead but never did. It was a cable structure, so structurally it was very interesting, in which it was supported and held down by the handball courts, the mass of the courts, and this air scooping system. It had airplane hangar doors that opened up and made this total theater. The old gymnasium was here. The linkage was a collector that would work for the pool at the entrance point. And so it was about a bunch of things. And looked like so from the ground. And in context with the old look like this. And this again is the idea of really working counter to the old, which I think marries the old as well as trying to repeat the old. And I think respecting the proportions in our openings against those openings and counterplaying makes as good a marriage, if not better, than trying to marry it to an historic piece that does something else. I also had a chance to do a advanced technology house, and this was about another series of ideas which was meant to be mobile and changeable. This was the little vehicle unit that was electrically driven and similar to the one that I had proposed for freeway systems earlier. It was to draw a unit that had the bath and kitchen and potential sleeping in it. So this was like a van. This would be like a miniature vehicle. This 14-foot diagram is not so dissimilar from my cubes before, but it was going to be out of plastic. Had the 4 opening ends. The idea was that these pieces could flip out in a variety of ways. The sides would drop down for decks. The top would pop up. The center could rotate and change. And so this was about a lot of kinetic ideas, as well as these other attachments. It's interesting. They've just come out with a vehicle now that does this, you know, the van where you get the car that disengages. I always wondered why they didn't put one of these things together for wrecked vehicles, because they're always pulling another car behind, which seems such a waste. And it seemed to me it was always better to break these things apart or attach them together to make a bigger thing. And then the wall was, the things I was recommending to NASA at that time was studies in a variety of wall types that would be double layered transparent materials in which we would put in gases and fluids to change that. So these were ideas and dreams. This was one of my few campus buildings. I had much the same experience that John Lautner did. This was my proposal, which they had tremendous 80 mile an hour winds. They wanted to solve that problem, and so I created this sort of airfoil for that. It was for the behavioral departments. I tried to develop a series of small courts around which each department would develop, and this was for students to come to talk to faculty, and I wanted it to be a place that would, where you got out of that little stupid cubby hole that we usually that you had to sit in at universities, and could be a little more lively and so forth. I was also knocked down by, it had other ideas of energy. They wanted me to talk about energy, and so we had water systems that worked, a bunch of stuff. But I got knocked down by my campus head of construction, and I was bombed, and the building ended up being a typical 3-court building and fairly conventional, and that's probably my first and last campus experience. A restaurant that had a bowstring truss and first was designed with that building to remain almost done. Then it was decided the building should go down, and so this truss was developed as a system of mechanical beam, upper member, a curve connector. It's kind of a strange trussing, but which would allow me a variety of ceiling types where they could either go, the ceilings could follow the curve to here, or they could flip up and skylight here. This whole area was raised and lower with glass, and it had a bunch of other stuff in it. But finally, the restaurateur and I didn't see eye to eye, and I got out of this job. This was a hotel idea I had down at the ocean, in which I'm always tired of going to hotels where when you go to the conferencing part, you're in the worst part of the building. You're always in the bowels, in these quiet, these closed-in spaces. So this was a whole green area that was the connecting element, but all of these were little meeting places and places where people could look down into, and these were going to be same thing, which had more glass and potential closure back and forth so that you could at least enjoy being at the sea. This whole side, the railings and parts of the balcony were all about solar collecting. It had a water spill on top of here that was about air conditioning and so forth. That also didn't fly. We continued to do industrial buildings. And I had the same industrial developer, and I had this one still in the works, which might fly one day, although it got caught in the Malibu cityhood problem. But it was about doing tilt-up buildings and in using industrial processes for things like housing or hotel units. And so this one still might go. And these are a couple of buildings that are in process now or near completion, along with that other one I said, that are still part of the same mentality of my 60s work, but it brings on, they become bigger and they have other people keep wanting them larger than they were, and then we started adding new frames to it and new pieces. But originally the idea of it was a combination of wood and steel rigid frame, which was rather unusual. And then these later pieces of steel were, because the owner kept pushing it out, it started at 7,000 square feet, and during construction it grew to 10. And so it's been kind of a happening. And but I'm used to happenings. I was part of this place, and so these things just go on. And I'm not sure if it's, but they're going. And that brings us up probably to the project that's in the office now. In 1986, both my two sons, Finn, who many of you might know, and Ron, who is about 6 years older and is up in San Francisco, joined me, and our firm became made up of the three of us and the people who work with us. And that's always, in my firm, it's never been more than 3 or 4 people, and today it's people like Tracy Stone, who I don't know if she's here tonight, and Joel Sherman, and Scott Fajak, who is a student here. And this project is really one that's designed, I think, sort of by all of us together in various stages. Finn is heading it up as design lead on it, but everybody's had a little bit of hand in it, and it's going through a variety of changes. And the way the office is working now, each of us usually takes our own projects. Finn is doing about 3 or 4 projects of his own that are in construction now, that hopefully someday he can present to you here. You won't have to listen to me anymore. And my older son is doing one up outside of San Francisco that's a little bit more in the attitude of my 60s work. And at the same time we're doing a development up there. I'm also very pro the architects being involved in development. We're doing an 11 unit, but trying to deal with lifestyles in a different manner. We're incorporating into this apartment unit daycare center, potential home office use that can be used in common, and a bunch of social spaces. It has sort of a co-housing mentality about it, and we're doing it sort of as an experiment in housing type. And then there's this project, which I'll go through quickly with you, and this will be the end of the presentation. But we have a fantastic site down at Palos Verdes, and this goes down to the ocean below. And but between the coastal and the planning, they're holding us 50 feet back from the top of the slope. So we're unable to really get out design the building so you can see whitewater from any of the spots. So we have that added part to deal with. We also have from point of entry to point of where you begin to have the key part of the site. We have a very long bridging or walking, which also is interesting. So what we've done is we've come from street, bridging through, taking our parking underneath, and thinking was to enter the building from the top and go down through the middle and then come down that way. There was also the potential to stroll out of the building at ground level and go out a different way, or even come back this way. There's a wall that starts from the ground that comes through the whole site, cuts it in half, and really is sort of separating the more public side from the private side of the project. the main part of the, and this project now, I think, incorporates a lot of ideas that we've used over time, only I think it brings it up to date in a better way. First, to go back to the whitewater idea, we were allowed to take a piece out to this point. So what we've done is we've bridged this piece out right to this point, but we've put it on a rotation. So we can take that rotation and get outside of our 50 feet by getting closer to the, that way. There was also the idea of developing a detractable or retractable unit that would sit in this point and then also pull out, and it could move around the site this way. We had, at the upper level of the bed, we had ideas of letting the bed come moving on out into the outer space so it could also move in and out. So we're developing kinetics, which have always been near and dear to me, and hopefully we can get some of them into this project. And some of the energy things are there too. It's really a square. It's a square within a circle, and there's two layers of glass. There's one that works the inside square, and there's a layer of glass that works the outside circle. And those can be open and closed independently, obviously. One is to have an indoor pool and an outdoor pool, and also be able to use that for mass. We're going to have a certain amount of greenhousing that can work, and be able to work it in that fashion. This whole unit is the children's and guest wing. It has its own indoor-outdoor play area. There's a gallery underneath, and a bunch of those kinds of things. And then there's the whole servants' end of it that's at this place. And so that's kind of where we are at this point in time, and I will close now, but I'll give you two more words and get out of here, and I won't be taking any questions because I don't think you probably want to stay any longer. But what I'd just like to say to the students, if I may, since I don't talk to you very much anymore, is, as I said earlier, I think part of the reason I went into education is that I felt not enough architects were really socially, politically involved. They didn't care enough about what was going on in their city. And thank God, I think there's a little more interest today than was going on in the 60s when we first started in the city. And I don't think you should, I think you should all be concerned about that. We started ADPSR in this school, architects, planners and designers for social responsibility. It was an idea of a student. A student came to me one day and said, "Why aren't architects more socially involved?" And I said, "I can't answer that. I wish they were, and I don't know why they aren't." She says, "Well, why don't we start an organization for that?" I said, "Wonderful, you start it." And so she put together a group, and a group of us, few faculty members got together. She couldn't get any students involved. I think we had a handful. A few of them are here that continued to be involved, Marta Perlis, and probably a few others I can't see. But it was very difficult to get students caring about these things. Rosemary Raven kind of took it under her wing, and we gave her the time to work on it here so that she could also build it. It's become a pretty big national organization. I think it's going to do more good now. At one time we were mostly about nuclear freeze, but I think now they're going to get into much more of the environmental and ecological issues, and I certainly invite more of the students to be part of that process. You'll learn a lot. You've got to learn the political process. I think you should learn the economic process, the way the economy works, the way development takes place. All of that is part of the thing. This bad-mouthing of the practitioner in the real world, I think that's bullshit. You've got to know those parts to be able to operate within it. I think, you can't be that. I mean, Michael talks about this thing of being the, how does he put it? I guess the what do you call them, Mike? The kind of the guys who are in the bushes, beating the tribes out there. But he knows the political process, and he understands that. And it's guerrilla warfare. Okay, the guerrilla warfare of architecture is something you have to know about, and you have to know how to fight it intelligently, not just only by the seat of your pants. So I invite you to get more involved with that, if you so desire, because some of you won't. And the other thing I believe very, very strongly is try to understand who you are in the education process, in your working process. Try to understand just how much order and disorder you need in your life. What are your dreams and your fantasies? What are those things that make you go around? I know what mine are. And I think once you grab that and you understand that, it's the only time you can begin to make architecture. Prior to that, you're kind of going from fad to fad and thing to thing. And if you join a fad, you're always going to be there too late. The ideas have already been put down. And all of us are victimized by this. This up here has a little bit of that, or some of that. But it also has a lot of things that I think our firm and I've been about for many, many years too. The part that I don't like, it deals with too much money in the wrong place. I wish the money going there was going into public housing or into affordable housing or into other areas. But we have to use these kind of jobs to learn from, and to learn to be able to put them back into the community. So again, as I guess I said to graduating classes before, you may like to do little things or big things or combinations. Make your choice. Have your beliefs. Have your fantasies, if you will. And above all, I think, choose life and don't forget to dream. Thank you.